Hi. Okay, so today we're going to be doing chapters 10 and 11. Chapters 10 and 11 are kind of short, which is why we're putting them together. There's a 9, 10, and 11 quiz on Schoology afterwards that I want you to take. It's multiple choice, shouldn't take you long. And the questions that are asked in multiple choice format are below, like we've been doing, as well as the whole PDF. If you don't want to listen with me and you just want to kind of read on your own. But you might want to because we'll be doing some other things with it. So I'm going to share my screen and let's go ahead and look at the vocab for 10 and 11. So the first word for 10, 11 was condescending. So when you say the word condescending, it's usually don't use that condescending tone, or don't speak to me, or don't condescend to me is the verb. So poor great Aunt Bertie, he said in a condescending voice. And I believe this is the Nazi soldier we're going to see us talking. So if you're using a condescending voice, you're talking down to somebody. So if I were to say to you, oh yes, that's an adjective. Ooh, you know what an adjective is. Finally, by grade 6. That would be horrible and that would sound awful. So when people are condescending, that's yucky. It's really kind of mean. So condescending means having or showing the feeling that you are superior. So don't be condescending. After a moment of rummaging through the folded things, he found a smaller winter jacket. So he was looking through a bunch of stuff. So rummaging, a rummage sale is when a bunch of things are kind of thrown in and you got to find what you're looking for. And when you're rummaging, you're searching untidily through a mass to find something. So you're looking through a bunch of stuff trying to find that one thing, which is really kind of a cool word as we start talking about all these words and their little nuances. So, you know, rummaging, instead of I was looking for something in a big pile of stuff, I was rummaging, looking for a smaller winter jacket. It sends a cleaner, more interesting message when you use better vocabulary. Next one is encased. The tiny child was completely encased in the worn red wool. So this tiny child is completely encased by this wool that's on top of him. So think about like to be like inside, cased, so like in a case. Encased means covered in a case or close fitting, surrounded. It was encased in it means it was like all over you. Anne-Marie could see it protruding from Mr. Rosen's pocket when he returned to the room. We've seen protrude a lot, and I think we've used that word a lot. And you should pretty much have it down now. But if something's protruding from a pocket and you can see it, it would make sense that you would substitute Anne-Marie could see it sticking out, and that's what protruding means. I think there's one more here. Commotion. There was a slight commotion outside the door and Mama went quickly to look out. So, you know, someone runs in the room and says, what's the commotion? A commotion is a state of confused, it's noisy. What's going on in here? It means everything's kind of haphazard and you know, loud, and that would be a commotion. So that's a noun. A commotion is a thing. So let's get out of this and go back to our book. Make sure I'm recording us. Am I recording us? Back to meeting. Let's make sure we're going here. So I believe we are. I'm going to stop the share for a second. Yes, we are. Okay. So as we're reading along, if there are words that you're unsure of, you know, take that moment to kind of figure them out. Don't just skim over words. This is kind of the point of doing this, kind of play with them a little bit and then learn a new word, which is really kind of cool to do. So let us open the casket. So here we are at Great Aunt Bertie's who never was funeral. You are all here now, Uncle Henrik said, looking around the living room. I must go. Anne-Marie stood in the wide doorway looking in from the hall. Baby slept now and its mother looked tired. Her husband sat beside her, his arms across her shoulders. The old man's head was still bent. Peter sat alone, leaning forward on his elbows on his knees. It was clear that he was in deep thought. On the sofa, Ellen sat between her parents, one hand clasped tightly in her mother's. She looked up at Anne-Marie but didn't smile. Anne-Marie felt a surge of sadness. The bond of their friendship had not broken, but it was as if Ellen had moved now into a different world, the world of her own family and whatever lay ahead for them. So think about what she must be going through right now and kind of the fear and confusion and the relief of seeing her parents, but being in this really tense situation. The elderly bearded man looked up suddenly as Uncle Henrik prepared to go. God keep you safe, he said in a firm but quiet voice. Uncle Henrik nodded. God keep us all safe, he replied. Then he turned and left the room. A moment later, Anne-Marie heard him leave the house. Mama brought the teapot from the kitchen and a tray of cups. Anne-Marie helped her pass the cups around. No one spoke. Anne-Marie, Mama whispered to her in the hall. You may go to bed if you want to. It is very late. Anne-Marie shook her head, but she was tired. She could see that Ellen was, too. Her friend's head was leaning on her mother's shoulder and her eyes closed now and then. Finally, Anne-Marie went to the empty rocking chair in the corner of the living room and curled there with her head against its soft, padded back. She dozed. She was startled from her half-sleep by the sudden sweep of headlights through the sheer curtains and across the room as a car pulled up outside. The car door slammed. Everyone in the room tensed, but no one spoke. So that means everyone would be like, you could see almost their hands would be clenching, their posture would straighten. She heard, as if in a recurring nightmare, the pounding on the door, and then the heavy, frightening, familiar staccato of boots on the kitchen floor. The woman with the baby gasped and began suddenly to weep. The male, accented voice from the kitchen was loud. We have observed, he said, that there is an unusual number of people have gathered at this house tonight. What is the explanation? There has been a death, Mama's voice replied kindly. It is always our custom to gather and pay our respects when a family member dies. I'm sure you are familiar with our customs. One of the officers pushed Mama ahead of him from the kitchen and entered the living room. There were others behind him. They filled the wide doorway. As always, their boots gleamed. Their guns, their helmets, all of them gleamed in the candlelight. What a formidable, intimidating presence they must have. Anne-Marie watched as the man's eyes moved around the room. He looked for a long time at the casket. Then he moved his gaze, focusing on each person in turn. When his eyes reached her, she looked back at him steadily. Who died? He asked harshly. No one answered. They watched Anne-Marie and she realized that the officer was directing the question at her. Now she knew for certain what Uncle Henrik had meant when he had talked to her in the barn. To be brave came more easily if you knew nothing. She swallowed. My great Aunt Bertie, she lied in a firm voice. The officer moved forward suddenly across the room to the casket. He placed one gloved hand on its lid. Poor great Aunt Bertie, he said in a condescending voice. I do know of your customs, he said, turning his gaze toward Mama, who stood in the doorway. And I know it is the custom to pay one's respect by looking your loved one in the face. It seems odd to me that you have closed this coffin up so tightly. His hand was in a fist, and he rubbed it across the edge of the polished lid. Why is it not open, he demanded. Let us open it and take one last look at great Aunt Bertie. Anne-Marie saw Peter across the room stiffen in his chair, lift his chin, and reach slowly with one hand toward his side. Maybe he's thinking if they open it and they don't see great Aunt Bertie in there might have to be some sort of gunfight. Maybe he has some sort of weapon at his side. Mama walked quickly across the room directly to the casket, directly to the officer. You're right, she said. The doctor said it should be closed because Aunt Bertie died of typhus, and he said there was a chance the germs would still be there, would still be dangerous. But what does he know? Only a country doctor and an old man at that. Surely typhus germs wouldn't linger in a dead person. And dear Aunt Bertie, I've been longing to see her face, to kiss her goodbye. Of course we will open the casket. I'm glad you suggested. With a swift motion, the Nazi officer slapped Mama across her face. She staggered backward with a white mark on her cheek darkened. You foolish woman, he spat. To think that we have any interest in seeing the body of your deceased aunt. Open it after we leave. With one gloved thumb, he pressed a candle flame into darkness. The hot wax spattered the table. Put all these candles out, he said, or pull the curtains. When he strode to the doorway and left the room, motionless, one hand to her cheek, Mama listened. They all listened as the uniformed men left the house. In a moment, they heard the car doors, the sound of the engine, and they finally heard it drive away. Mama, Anne-Marie cried. Her mother shook her head and glanced at the open window, covered only by the sheer curtain. Anne-Marie understood. There still might be soldiers outside, watching, listening. Peter stood and drew the dark curtains across the windows. He relit the extinguished candle. Then he reached for the old Bible that had always been there on the mantel. He opened it quickly and said, I will read a psalm. His eyes turned to the page he had opened at random, and he began to read. Oh, praise the Lord. How good it is to sing psalms to our God. How pleasant to praise him. The Lord is rebuilding Jerusalem. He gathers in the scattered sons of Israel. It is he who heals the broken in spirit and binds up their wounds. He who numbers the stars one by one. What's the name of the book? Mama sat down and listened. Gradually, they each began to relax. Anne-Marie could see the old man across the room moving his lips as Peter read. He knew the ancient psalm by heart. Anne-Marie didn't. The words were unfamiliar to her, and she tried to listen, tried to understand, tried to forget the war and the Nazis, tried not to cry, tried to be brave. The night breeze moved the dark curtains at the open windows. Outside, she knew the sky was speckled with stars. Could anyone number them one by one, as the psalm said? There were too many. The sky was too big. Ellen had said that her mother was frightened of the ocean, that it was too cold and too big. The sky was too, Anne-Marie thought. The whole world was too cold, too big, and too cruel. Peter read on in his firm voice, though it was clear he was tired. The long minutes passed. They seemed hours. Finally, still reading, he moved quietly to the window. He closed the Bible and listened to the quiet night. Then he looked around the room. Now, he said, it is time. First, he closed the windows. Then he went to the casket and opened the lid. So, number the stars, too many. There's so much sadness. There's so much going on, and so many of the Jewish people, numbering them one by one. It's very, very too big of a number to grasp of the enormity of what's going on in the Holocaust at this time. And that's kind of making reference to that. Chapter 11, will we see you again soon, Peter? Anne-Marie blinked. Across the dark room, she saw Ellen, too, peering into the narrow wooden box in surprise. There was no one in the casket at all. Instead, it seemed to be stuffed with folded blankets and articles of clothing. Peter began to lift the things out and distribute them to the silent people in the room. He handed heavy coats to the man and wife, and another to the old man with the beard. It will be very cold, he murmured. Put them on. He found a thick sweater for Mrs. Rosen and a woolen jacket for Ellen's father. After a moment of rummaging through the folded things, he found a smaller winter jacket and handed it to Ellen. So I'm just going to let them in. But let me ask you this question. Think about, come on, Teddy Cookie. Why do you think they all need coats and they all need some winter belongings right now? Thank you. Anne-Marie watched as Ellen took the jacket in her arms and looked at it. It was patched and worn. It was true that there had been a few new clothes for anyone during the recent years. But still, Ellen's mother had always managed to make clothes for her daughter, often using old things that she was able to take apart and refashion in a way that made them seem brand new. Never had Ellen worn anything so shabby and old. but she put it on, pulled it around her, and buttoned the mismatched buttons. Peter, his arms full of the odd pieces of clothing, looked toward the silent couple with the infant. "I'm sorry," he said to them. "There's nothing for the baby." "I'll find something," Mama said quickly. "The baby must be warm." She left the room and was back in a moment with Kirsty's thick red sweater. "Here," she said softly to the mother. "It'll be much too big, but that will make it even warmer for him." The woman spoke for the first time. She whispered. "She's a girl. Her name is Rachel." Mama smiled and helped her direct the sleeping baby's arms into the sleeves of the sweater. Together they buttoned the heart-shaped buttons. How Kirsty loved that sweater with its heart buttons. Until the tiny child was completely encased in the warm red wool. Her eyelids fluttered, but she didn't wake. Peter reached into his pocket and took something out. He went to the parents and leaned down toward the baby. He opened the lid of the small bottle in his hand. "How much does she weigh?" Peter asked. "She was 7 pounds when she was born," the young woman replied. "She's gained a little, but not very much. Maybe she weighs 8 pounds now, no more." "A few drops will be enough then. It has no taste. She won't even notice." The mother tightened her arms around the baby and looked up at Peter, pleading. "Please, no," she said. "She always sleeps all night. Please, she doesn't need it. I promise she won't cry." Peter's voice was firm. "We can't take a chance," he said. He inserted the dropper of the bottle into the baby's tiny mouth and squeezed a few drops of liquid onto her tongue. The baby yawned and swallowed. The mother closed her eyes. Her husband gripped her shoulder. Next, Peter removed the folded blankets from the coffin, one by one, handed them around. "Carry these with you," he said. "You will need them later for warmth." Anne-Marie's mother moved around the room and gave each person a small package of food, the cheese and bread and apples that Anne-Marie had helped her prepare in the kitchen hours before. Finally, Peter took a paper-wrapped packet from the inside of his own jacket. He looked around the room at the assembled people, now dressed in the bulky winter clothing, and then motioned to Mr. Rosen, who followed him to the hall. Anne-Marie could overhear their conversation. "Mr. Rosen," Peter said, "I must get this to Henrik, but I might not see him. I'm going to take the others only to the harbor, and they will go to the boat alone. I want you to deliver this without fail. It is of great importance." There was a moment of silence in the hall, and Anne-Marie knew that Peter must be giving the packet to Mr. Rosen. Anne-Marie could see it protruding from Mr. Rosen's pocket when he returned to the room and sat down. She could see, too, that Mr. Rosen had a puzzled look. He didn't know what the packet contained. He hadn't asked. It was one more time, Anne-Marie realized, when they protected one another by not telling. If Mr. Rosen knew, he might be frightened. If Mr. Rosen knew, he might be in danger. So he hadn't asked, and Peter hadn't explained. Again, this kind of recurring, it's easier to be brave if you don't know everything that's going on. And so Peter obviously gave the baby some drops that would make the baby sleep. And the mother, of course, being afraid to give your baby medicine that's going to make it, non-responsive would be scary. But if they were hiding somewhere and the baby started crying, it would be the end for everyone, including the baby. So it's a risk, I guess, they had to take. "Now," Peter said, looking at his watch, "I will lead the first group, you and you and you." He gestured to the old man and to the young people with their baby. "Inge," he said. Anne-Marie realized that it was the first time she had heard Peter Nielsen call her mother by her first name. Before, it had always been Mrs. Johansson, or in the old days, during the merriment and excitement of his engagement to Lise, it had been occasionally Mama. Now it was Inge. It was as if he had moved beyond his own youth and had taken his place in the world of adults. Her mother nodded and waited for his instructions. "You wait 20 minutes and then bring the Rosens. Don't come sooner. We must be separate on the path so there's less chance of being seen." Mrs. Johansson nodded. "Come directly back to the house after you have seen the Rosens safely to Henrik. Stay in the shadows and on the back path. And you know that, of course. By the time you get the Rosens to the boat," Peter went on, "I will be gone. As soon as I deliver my group, I must move on. There's other work to be done tonight." So other people, other missions. He's part of the resistance that you're learning about with Mrs. Jacobson. He turned to Anne-Marie. "So I will say goodbye to you now." Anne-Marie went to him and gave him a hug. "But we will see you again soon?" she asked. "I hope so," Peter said. "Very soon. Don't grow much more or you'll be taller than I am, little long legs. Anne-Marie smiled, but Peter's comment was no longer the lighthearted fun of the past. It was only a brief grasp at something that had gone. Peter kissed Mama wordlessly. Then he wished the Rosens Godspeed, and he led the others through the door. Mama, Anne-Marie, and the Rosens sat in silence. There was a slight commotion outside the door, and Mama went quickly to look out. In a moment, she was back. It's all right, she said in response to their looks. The old man stumbled, but Peter helped him up. He didn't seem to be hurt, maybe just his pride. She added, smiling a bit. It was an odd word, pride. Anne-Marie looked at the Rosens sitting there, wearing the misshapen, ill-fitted clothing, holding ragged blankets folded in their arms, their faces drawn and tired. She remembered the earlier, happier times. Mrs. Rosen, her hair neatly combed and covered, lighting the Sabbath candles, saying the ancient prayer, and Mr. Rosen sitting in the big chair in their living room, studying his thick books, correcting papers, adjusting his glasses, looking up now and then to complain good-naturedly about the lack of decent light. She remembered Ellen in the school play, moving confidently across the stage, her gestures sure, her voice clear. So I want you just to get kind of an idea of this, and I want you to understand, and this is really what, sometimes when you hear about the Holocaust and you hear about, these wars, you think about them happening to people that are nothing like you. It's almost like it's separate. It doesn't almost seem real. But this was very real, and these were very real people who spent their days doing stuff in a town just like we would do things. And all of a sudden, their whole life is turned around, and their lives are in danger for no other reason other than their religion. All those things, those sources of pride, the candlesticks, the books, the daydreams of theater, had been left behind in Copenhagen. They had nothing with them now. There was only the clothing of unknown people for warmth, the food from Henrik's farm for survival, and the dark path ahead through the woods to freedom. Anne-Marie realized, though she had not really been told, that Uncle Henrik was going to take them in his boat across the sea to Sweden. She knew how frightened Mrs. Rosen was of the sea, its width, its depth, its cold. She knew how frightened Ellen was of the soldiers with their guns and boots, who were certainly looking for them. And she knew how frightened they all must be of the future. But their shoulders were as straight as they had been in the past, in the classroom, on the stage, at the Sabbath table. So there were other sources, too, of pride, and they had not left everyone behind. So, we're going to follow them on their journey to where they're going. And I know Mrs. Jacobson has talked to you about looking across to Sweden and Uncle Henrik's boat. And clearly they're trying to get over there. So we go ahead, take the 9, 10, and 11, and I will see you tomorrow.